It was the spring of 2005, and the excitement buzzed in the air like static before a thunderstorm. Prom night at South Marlborough High School was the event of the year, a night of glamour and glitz. But beneath the surface of our giddy anticipation lurked something darker, more foreboding that sent shivers down my spine. At least for me. The gymnasium where the prom was held was a cavernous space, transformed by twinkling fairy lights and cascades of satin drapes. The air was heavy with the scent of flowers, and the sound of laughter and music echoed off the walls. But as I looked through the wide doors leading onto the playing field, a sense of unease washed over me. Beyond the gym stretched a vast expanse of open space, the playing field illuminated by the soft glow of moonlight. But it was what lay beyond that sent a chill down my spine. A dense forest loomed on the horizon, its trees standing tall and imposing, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers grasping at the night sky. There was something about the forest that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Despite the festivities surrounding me, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if unseen eyes lurked in the darkness of the forest, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal themselves. And as the night wore on, that feeling only grew stronger, until it felt as though the very air was charged with a sense of impending doom. Prom night should have been a time of joy and celebration, but as I stood there gazing out at the ominous forest, I couldn't shake the feeling of something sinister lurking beyond the trees. As a 17-year-old boy, I had my fair share of fears and phobias like any other teenager. The most recent one was asking Linda Mathers to come as my date for the evening. Unfortunately for me, however, she was already going with the school's math genius, Mike Lawson. A good guy, so I couldn't really blame her. It took me ages to work up the courage for that particular task, but there was one fear that gripped me tighter than any other. Cynophobia, the fear of dogs, or in my case, all things canine. It wasn't just any fear. It was a deep-seated terror that had its roots in a traumatic event from my childhood. Not that I hate dogs, it's just the misfortune of them being so closely related to an animal that actually caused the phobia to trigger. When I was young, barely 8 years old, I had a harrowing encounter with a starving coyote. It happened one evening when I was venturing too far into the woods behind my house, chasing after a stray ball. The coyote came out of nowhere, its eyes gleaming with hunger and malice as it lunged at me with its teeth bared. The attack was swift and brutal, leaving me with deep scratches and scars, both physical and emotional. Luckily for me, my cat at the time actually managed to scare it off by running over and scratching it on the face. I'll always love you, Sooty, you crazy ball of black fur. Ever since that day, however, the mere sight or sound of a dog sent my heart racing and my palms sweating. And it wasn't just domestic dogs that terrified me, it was any canine, no matter how big or how small. Occasionally, a coyote would get brave enough to raid the school trash, and the news would eventually circle back to me in the form of the odd joke at my expense, since by now everyone knew they freaked me out. I have since started becoming braver in an attempt to overcome my crippling phobia, forcing myself to learn more about canine behavior, evolution, diet, etc. And I've even developed a bit of a respect for the animals, at least from behind a TV screen. It still sends me reeling whenever I'm face to face with anything remotely dog-like. So when prom night rolled around and I found myself standing in the gymnasium, staring out at the dark expanse of the forest beyond the playing fields, my fear threatened to consume me. The thought of venturing anywhere near those trees, even in the safety of a crowded event, filled me with a sense of dread that bordered on panic. I knew the chances of encountering a coyote were slim, especially in areas as populated as this, but the irrationality of my fear did little to quell this intensity. And so, I stayed as far away from the forest as possible, my eyes darting nervously towards the tree line every few seconds, half expecting to see the glint of predatory eyes staring back at me. Lost in my thoughts, staring out at the ominous forest, I was startled when a voice broke through the haze of my anxiety. "Hey, Simon," it said, and I turned to see Linda Mathers standing before me, a polite smile on her lips. Despite the sting of rejection I could still feel, I couldn't deny the flutter of excitement that stirred within me at the sight of her. "Hey, Linda," I replied, forcing a smile of my own as I tried to push aside my fears and focus on the present. "Having a good time?" Linda nodded, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Yeah, it's been amazing so far. The decorations are stunning, don't you think?" I glanced around at the twinkling lights and satin drapes, nodding in agreement. "Yeah, they really went all out this year." As Linda continued to make polite conversation, I found myself momentarily distracted from the looming darkness outside. Her presence was like a beacon of light in the midst of my fear, grounding me in the here and now. But as much as I tried to focus on Linda and the festivities surrounding us, my mind kept drifting back to the forest beyond the gymnasium doors. The sense of unease that had settled over refused to dissipate. This was supposed to be a time of celebration and camaraderie, but for me, like every other day, it was a constant battle against my phobia. Finally able to push myself away from the nagging thought of visiting Canis Latrans, I noticed that Linda was without her date for the night. "Hey, Linda," I interjected mid-rant about colleges she was thinking about going to, and trying to divert my own train of thought from the forest. I asked, "Where's Mike? I thought you two were inseparable tonight." Linda's smile faltered slightly, and she glanced around before leaning in closer, as if sharing a deep secret. "Oh, he's off, doing his own thing for a bit," she replied in a hushed tone. "He went to buy some weed from a dealer who set up shop in the woods tonight." My heart skipped a beat at the mention of woods, my fear again rearing its ugly head once more. "In the woods?" I echoed, unable to hide the apprehension in my voice. Linda nodded, oblivious to my unease. "Yeah, apparently the guy's got some really good stuff and Mike couldn't resist," she explained with a shrug. "But don't worry, he'll be back soon." I forced a weak smile, trying to mask the rising panic bubbling within me. The thought of Mike wandering into the forest alone, especially at night, sent a chill down my spine. But I didn't want to burden Linda with my irrational fears, so I nodded and feigned nonchalance. "Right, well, I hope he knows what he's doing," I muttered, my gaze drifting back to the dark expanse of trees. "But what about you, Simon? Did you manage to find someone to go with after I turned you down?" she asked in a joking manner. I felt a flush of embarrassment heat my cheeks at the reminder of my failed attempt to secure a prom date. "Oh, no," I stammered, trying to mask my disappointment with a forced smile. "I didn't really look for one after you. And besides, it was too short notice anyway." Linda nodded sympathetically, her gaze softening. "Sorry, Simon. I didn't mean to put you on the spot," she said, reaching out to squeeze my arm gently. "But hey, you're here enjoying yourself, right? That's all that matters." I managed a weak smile in response, grateful for Linda's understanding. Despite the pang of loneliness that gnawed at my heart, her words offered a sliver of comfort amidst my growing unease. "Yeah, you're right," I replied, trying to push aside my own insecurities. "I'm here. That's what counts." As Linda and I exchanged small talk, a sudden cacophony erupted from the depths of the forest. The strangest noises I'd ever heard. Already on edge, my mind processed them as inhuman howls that tore through the night air, a horrifying blend of human screams and coyote wails that seemed to claw their way into my very soul. The eerie sound echoed across the playing field, drawing the attention of those nearby. Conversations faltered, laughter died down, and uneasy murmurs rippled through the crowd. But as quickly as it had begun, the unearthly howling subsided, leaving only a stunned silence in its wake. For most, the interruption was nothing more than a brief disturbance, easily dismissed as a trick of the wind or a cry of some unknown animal. But for me, it was a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurked beyond the safety of the gymnasium walls. As the party resumed around me, the music pumping and laughter ringing out once more, I felt the first tendrils of panic creeping into my heart. It hammered against my ribs, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps as a wave of nausea washed over me. I tried to push aside the rising tide of fear, to bury it beneath a facade of normalcy, but it was no use. The memory of my childhood attack lurched to the forefront of my mind, forcing me to relive it, filling me with a sense of dread that threatened to consume me whole. Desperate to escape the suffocating grip of my anxiety, I turned to Linda, my voice trembling as I struggled to maintain my composure. "I think I need to get away for a sec," I stammered, forcing a weak smile. "I'll be back in a minute." With that, I hurried toward the hallways, desperate to put as much distance between myself and the forest as possible. Linda had always been more than just a casual acquaintance and crush. She'd been my friend for years. We'd grown up together, sharing countless childhood memories and weathering the storms of adolescence side by side. And when I was at my lowest, she'd been there for me in ways that I could never forget. I vividly remembered the panic attack I had suffered in 4th grade, triggered by a stray dog that wandered onto the playground during recess. As my classmates scattered in fear, I found myself frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest as the world spun around me. But amidst the chaos, Linda had been a steady presence at my side, her voice a calming balm in the midst of my terror. With gentle words and a reassuring touch, she had guided me through the worst of it, helping me to regain control of my racing thoughts and quell the rising panic within me. From that moment on, Linda had become my rock, my confidant, my constant source of support. She never judged me for my fears or belittled my struggles. Instead, she stood by me unwaveringly, offering a shoulder to lean on whenever I needed it the most. And now, as I struggled to fend off another panic attack, it was Linda's face that flashed before my eyes. Her presence, a comforting reminder that I was not alone in this battle. Though she may not have understood why I felt such an extreme reaction, she had never once wavered in her loyalty to me, and for that, I was eternally grateful. After retreating from the chaos of the prom, seeking the solace in the quiet confines of the school hallway, Linda and I found ourselves leaning against a row of lockers, my breaths coming in ragged gasps as I tried to steady my nerves. But in the relative safety of the hallway, the memory of those unearthly howls still lingered in the air like a dark omen. As the minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, Linda couldn't help but glance towards the gymnasium doors, her brow furrowed with concern.
"Simon,"
she began, her voice barely above a whisper.
"Do you think Mike's okay? He's been gone for a long time. Were those noises out there? I'm kind of worried."
Her words trailed off, but her unspoken fear hung heavy in the air between us. I knew exactly what she was thinking. The same dark thoughts that had been gnawing at the edges of my mind ever since Mike had ventured into the woods. I swallowed hard, trying to push aside the rising tide of panic threatening to overwhelm me again. "I'm sure he's fine," I replied, though even I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. "Maybe he got caught up talking to someone or lost track of time." But even as I spoke those words, doubts nagged at the corner of my mind. The forest was no place to wander alone, especially not at night, and the thought of Mike stumbling into danger was unnerving. Linda bit her lip, her eyes darting nervously towards the gymnasium doors once more.
"I just can't shake this feeling that something's wrong,"
she admitted, her voice trembling with worry. I reached out a hand and squeezed her shoulder, offering what little comfort I could muster. "We'll go look for him," I promised, though the words felt hollow even in my own ears, especially since they had to compete with the drumming of my terrified heart at the very notion. Regardless, I cared too much about her to let her go alone. Together, we'll find him and bring him back safely, I promise. As we worked our way across the busy dance floor and towards the doors leading out onto the field, I did my best to control myself. If you've ever anticipated the drop on a roller coaster, then you have a rough idea of what I was experiencing right about this point. But as soon as we reached the doors, it seemed our noble rescue mission was terminated. Looking out into the night, we could see a figure emerging from the darkness of the forest, stumbling towards us with an unnatural gait. My heart lurched in my chest as I recognized the familiar form of Mike. But something wasn't quite right. He moved with an eerie stiffness, his limbs jerking and twitching in a way that looked robotic. His eyes were wide and vacant, devoid of any recognition as he lumbered closer, each step a labored effort. "Linda, that's Mike," I whispered, my voice barely a breath as I gripped her arm tightly. "But something's not right. We need to be careful, he might be really high." Linda's eyes widened in horror as she took in the sight before us. Her hand gripped mine.
"What happened to him?"
she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. But before either of us could move, Mike had reached us, his vacant gaze fixed on some point in the distance beyond our reach. He mumbled something unintelligible, his words slurred and garbled as if spoken from a mouth not his own. A strange sensation settled over the air, like a thick fog creeping in from the forest. His smile was unnaturally wide, his eyes devoid of their usual warmth. Linda's brow furrowed with more concern, her anger starting to dissipate into a tense unease.
"Mike, where have you been?"
she demanded, her voice tinged with frustration.
"We've been worried sick about you."
But Mike remained silent, his smile never faltering as he continued to stare at us with an intensity that continued to send shivers down my spine. It was as if he was looking right through us, his gaze unseeing and distant, like a man possessed. It was this that caused Linda's anger to boil over, her patience worn thin by the tension of the night.
"Are you high or something?"
she snapped, her voice tinged with disappointment.
"Is that why you're acting this weird?"
Still, Mike said nothing, his silence stretching on like a heavy weight between us. And as he continued to smile that eerie smile, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong with him. I was about to ask him if he needs some help or something, but all of a sudden he walks past us without a care in the world. His strange gait seemed to dissipate, replaced by an air of confidence as he strode purposely across the dance floor. Linda and I exchanged a perplexed glance, unsure of what to make of his sudden change in behavior. Ignoring us completely, Mike approached a random girl who was swaying on the dance floor, her movements clumsy and erratic from what appeared to be a heavy bout of intoxication. With a gentle touch, he took her hand, and to our surprise, she responded with a seductive smile, possibly impressed by his forwardness, her drunken haze momentarily clearing as she looked up at him. Linda's confusion deepened, her brow furrowing in disbelief as she watched the scene unfold before us.
"What the hell does he think he's doing?"
she whispered, her voice tinged with awestruck anger. I shook my head, equally puzzled by Mike's sudden shift in focus. "I have no idea," I responded, my gaze fixed on the pair as they disappeared into the crowded halls, leaving us behind in a cloud of confusion. As the music throbbed on and the revelry continued around us, Linda and I were left standing in stunned silence, trying to make sense of the bizarre encounter we just had. But amidst the chaos of the prom, one thing was clear. Something was up with Mike. Linda's frustration simmered as she watched Mike disappear into the crowd with the intoxicated girl, her disappointment palpable in the air between us. With a heavy sigh, she turned to me, her eyes pleading for understanding.
"Simon, I just want to go home,"
she said, her voice tinged with hurt and anger.
"Can't believe he would ditch me for some random girl."
I nodded sympathetically, my own sense of unease growing with each passing moment. "I understand, Linda," I replied, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "But before we leave, we need to make sure Mike isn't going to do something stupid whilst he's on whatever he's on." Linda's eyes widened in realization, her expression softened as she considered my words.
"You're right,"
she admitted reluctantly.
We can't just leave him like this. Who knows what trouble he might get himself into?
Determined now, we set out to find Mike, weaving our way through the throngs of dancing teens as we made our way back into the hallway. We approached a group of students, hoping to glean some information about Mike's whereabouts. Among them was a standard stoner-looking kid, his eyes glassy and red as he puffed on a joint. He looked up as we approached, a lazy smile spread across his face. "Hey, you guys looking for someone?" he drawled, the words slurring slightly as he exhaled a cloud of smoke.
"Yeah, have you seen Mike?"
I asked, trying to keep my tone casual despite the rising sense of urgency gnawing at my insides. The stoner guy took another drag from his joint before nodding slowly. "Yeah, man, I saw him heading into the woman's locker room with some chick a little while ago," he replied, his words tinged with amusement. Linda's eyes widened in alarm, her grip tightening on my arm.
"What? Why? Why would he go in there?"
she exclaimed, her voice rising with panic. I shot her a reassuring glance before turning back to the stoner guy. "Thanks, man," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But are you sure he's okay? Like, is he high or something? He looks it." The stoner guy shook his head, his expression turning serious for the first time since we'd approached him. "Nah, man, something's not right about him," he replied cryptically. "I've been around a lot of drugs in my time, and trust me, Mike ain't high. There's just something off about him. Something different. The dude locked eyes with me and wouldn't drop his smile. I've been there before, you know, but I don't know, man, his glare just hurt to look into." A sense of dread settled over us as we entered the women's locker room, the air heavy with anticipation and fear. It appeared empty at first, but as we listened intently, a sickening sound reached our ears, a wet slapping noise that made me cringe. Linda's anger flared at the sound, her frustration boiling over as she rushed towards the source without a second thought. I followed close behind, my heart pounding in my chest as we approached one of the changing stalls. With a swift motion, Linda tore open the door, revealing a scene right out of a nightmare. There, before us, was Mike. His jaws unhinged like some monstrous serpent as he slowly tried to consume the girl from the party. The girl's hands slapped desperately at Mike's grotesque face, her cries of terror muffled from within the creature's maw as she fought to free herself from his grasp. But it was no use. Mike's grip was unyielding, his monstrous form towering over her like a predator to its prey. Horror washed over me like a tidal wave as I watched the scene unfold before my eyes. The girl's struggle grew weaker with each passing moment, her desperate cries fading into anguished whimpers as Mike continued his gruesome feast. Linda's scream pierced the air, a primal sound of terror and despair as she stumbled back in horror. Tears streamed down her face as she recoiled from the grotesque sight before us, her mind struggling to comprehend the unimaginable horror unfolding in front of her. But even as my own mind reeled with shock and disbelief, a cold certainty settled over me like a lead weight. Whatever Mike had become, whatever dark forces had twisted him into this monstrous form, there was no denying the grim reality before us. With a sense of determination, I knew that we had to act, and fast. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I scanned the room frantically for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on an old door, its handle jutting out at an odd angle. Without hesitation, I lunged towards it, tearing the handle free with a desperate strength I didn't know I possessed. Turning back to face the horrifying scene before me, I steeled myself for what I knew I had to do. With a primal roar, I charged forward, the makeshift weapon clenched tightly in my trembling fist. In one swift motion, I drove the jagged end of the door handle towards the creature's eye, my movements fueled by a fierce resolve to save the girl from its clutches. The makeshift weapon struck true, sinking deep into the creature's grotesque eye with a sickening squelch. The guttural roar of pain echoed through the room as the creature recoiled in agony, releasing its grip on the girl. With a gasp of relief, she stumbled away from the writhing mass of flesh and bone, her eyes wide with shock and gratitude. But there was no time to revel in our victory. With a renewed sense of urgency, I seized the girl's hand, pulling her towards the safety of the exit as Linda followed close behind. As we burst out into the hallway, the sounds of chaos and panic echoed through the building, a testament to the horror that unfolded within the confines of the locker room. As the creature let out another guttural roar, a haunting echo of the same unearthly howl that sent shivers down our spines earlier, panic erupted through the school like a wildfire. The sound reverberated through the halls, sending students and teachers alike into a frenzy of fear and confusion. A stampede began, a tidal wave of bodies surging through the corridors as everyone scrambled to escape the source of the terrifying noise. Doors slammed shut, lockers rattled, and screams pierced the air as chaos engulfed the building. Linda, the girl, and I were swept up in a frantic rush, clinging onto each other for dear life as we fought against the tide of panicked humanity. Fear gnawed at my insides, threatening to overwhelm me again as I struggled to make our way through the chaos. As the stampede of panicked students rushed past us, the girl we had rescued was swept away with the tide, disappearing into the chaos along with the rest of the fleeing crowd. Linda and I exchanged a worried glance, but there was no time to dwell on her fate as a new threat emerged before us. Turning our attention back towards the gymnasium, we were met with a chilling sight. More people were emerging from the field, their faces twisted into the same eerie smile that Mike had worn earlier. Their eyes were vacant, devoid of emotion, as they shuffled towards the school with an unsettling sense of purpose. Linda's grip tightened on my arm, her voice trembling with fear as she whispered,
"What's happening, Simon? What are they?"
I shook my head, my mind racing with possibilities but finding no answers.
"I don't know,"
I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper.
"But whatever it is, it can't be good."
Grabbing Linda's hand, I led her away towards the rest of the students and teachers, fleeing through the halls that felt as though they were suddenly closing in around us. But before long, we see the main doors of the school and the confused faces of everyone lingering beyond them. Crashing out into the night, we look around to see we're the last ones out. Slowly shuffling in from a distant, unlit classroom, 4 students with wide smiles make their way towards the exit. Linda and I lock eyes for a second time before rushing to jam the doors, grabbing a nearby chair the attendance taker was using at the start of the night to seal it closed.
"What the fuck is going on?"
One student asked as we stood there gasping. He was seemingly unaware, like many people, to the danger. He didn't have to wait long, though. As the creatures reached the entrance, their smiles contorted into snarls of frustration as they pounded on the doors with unnerving strength. The air was thick with tension, as everyone realized they were not ordinary people. There was something else entirely, wearing human skin like a grotesque disguise. Standing shoulder to shoulder, Linda and I watched as the creatures thrashed and clawed, their efforts futile against the barricade we had created. With a heavy sigh of relief, I turned away, knowing that for now we were safe. Joining the others gathered outside, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered in the pit of my stomach. The school's principal, Mr. Thompson, emerged from the crowd, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern as he surveyed the scene before him. His eyes widened in shock as they fell upon the strange, shuffling figures trapped behind the doors, their inhuman appearance sending shivers down his spine.
"What's going on here?"
he asked, his voice trembling slightly as he took a step backwards, his hands instinctively reaching out to steady himself against the nearest wall. Linda and I looked at each other again, unsure of how to explain what had unfolded within the walls of the school. But before we could respond, the principal's gaze shifted back to the trapped creatures, his face draining of color as he realized the true nature of the threat before him.
They're not human,"
he whispered, his voice barely audible above the murmurs of the crowd. As I stood, I became frozen in fear. My eyes locked onto the smiling-faced person approaching from the nearby trees. A dread gripped my heart like a vice. The sight of that unnatural smile amongst the crowd caused me to almost black out, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Around us, the crowd erupted into screams of terror, but their cries were soon drowned out by the haunting calls of the creatures. The sound reverberated through the air like a sinister symphony. Linda's hand found mine, her grip tight with fear as we watched the smiling-faced person draw nearer, their expression devoid of any humanity. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave, threatening to overwhelm any sense as I realized the true extent of the danger we were facing. But even as my mind screamed at me to run, to flee from the horrors closing in around us, I found myself rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away from the approaching figures. It was as if some unseen force held me in its grip, paralyzing me with terror as the smiling-faced person drew closer and closer. That's when something incredible happened. As the tension in the air reached its peak and the creatures closed in on us, a sudden, unexpected presence emerged from the shadows. Trotting over from the school's massive trash bins with an air of regal command was a lone coyote, no bigger than a border collie. At first, I couldn't believe my eyes. What was a coyote doing here in the midst of this chaos? But as it approached the nearest of the creatures, dropping a bag of discarded chips from its mouth, a sense of hope began to stir within me that I couldn't explain. With a regal grace, the coyote stood before the creature, its gaze unwavering as it emitted a loud howl that pierced through the chaos. The creatures, momentarily distracted from their pursuit, all turned their heads in unison to face the small canine, their movements hesitant and uncertain. As the coyote continued its courageous stand against the creatures, its calls were soon joined by a cacophony of other animal sounds. Barking dogs, screeching fox calls, and the haunting howls of unseen canines echoed through the night, creating another symphony, one of defiance against the encroaching darkness. The creatures seemed to become overwhelmed by the sudden onslaught of animal noises. Gripping their heads in pain, they staggered backwards, their movements erratic and uncoordinated as they struggled to fend off the barrage of sounds assaulting their senses. And then, as if guided by some unseen force, the creatures were suddenly pulled backwards, as if they were puppets being yanked on invisible strings. Dozens of them disappeared into the depths of the forest, their forms vanishing into the darkness of the trees. As the last of the creatures disappeared from sight, a profound silence descended upon the scene, broken only by the distant echoes of the animals. Linda and I, and everyone else, stood in stunned silence, scarcely daring to believe the nightmare was finally over. As if unfazed by the happenings and the massive crowd of people, the coyote leant down and picks up the bag of chips, gives a quick glance in my direction as if saying, "You're welcome, keep the trash coming," and saunters off towards the forest. I collapsed right there. In the days, weeks, and eventually years that followed, I found my fear had 180'd into an obsession. I'm now drawn to canines in a way I never had been before. The bravery of that lone coyote had left a lasting impression on me, and I found a new appreciation for these noble creatures. The fact that they had some inherent mastery over those creatures that we found so terrifying is still unbelievable. I still wake up with nightmares of that night, but my coyote German Shepherd rescue Lily helps keep those fears at bay. Eventually, me and Linda got together, and after 19 years, we're still going strong. We're due our first child in the spring. The school recovered from the ordeal. There was an intense sense of renewal in the air. I have no idea what the school told the police about the missing students, but that's not my job, to be fair. I just hope those kids didn't suffer. But the old fears and divisions that had once plagued us were replaced by a newfound sense of unity and purpose. And, in a symbolic gesture of solidarity, the school decided to change its mascot to a coyote, honoring our unlikely hero that came to us in our time of need. Needless to say, whenever I drive past and catch a glimpse of the campus, the coyotes around there have been looking extra plump these days.